Good evening. Can you hear me? Is it on? Is it on? Is it on? Is this thing on? Listen, the last thing I need is a bunch of noise from the peanut gallery, all right? Well, I want to tell you now, tonight we are celebrating the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter. And it is one of the famous furniture feasts. So, you don't know about the others, but we have, for example, the sleeper sofa of St. Andrew. That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. I can't even go through with it. And so what I want to say, though, is on this feast of the Chair of St. Peter, tonight we have these wonderful readings, the great reading from Matthew, the charge of St. Peter, and I just want you to know that I'm not going to talk about that at all. I want to talk about something else. I want to continue with what I started last night. So how many of you were not here last night? Lord have mercy, where were you? I know that there wasn't a Kentucky basketball game on or anything. You know, they always give me missions like during the time of the Kentucky basketball game, you know. And so you show up for the last night, and it's the championship night, you know, and there are like 3 children in the front row, you know, who can't even turn the TV on. Do y'all want to move or something, or do you want to sit there? Are you sure? You do not look very comfortable. Oh, okay, the chair. The chair of Father Martin tonight. I want to continue with my little theme from last night, looking at the Gospel of St. Luke. And if we had a lot of time, which we don't, I mean in terms of several days to spend together, we would go systematically down that road with Jesus until he gets back to Jerusalem. What I want to go now to do, though, is to go right to the end. I want to go right to the end of the Gospel. And so what happens is the disciples, they get to Jerusalem. Obviously, as we know, Jesus undergoes his passion. He is crucified. He dies. He is buried. And then 3 days after his crucifixion, some women go to visit his tomb, right? And he is not there. And then what St. Luke, that gospel writer who puts everything together in such a very careful way, what St. Luke does is he gives us a story at the very end of the gospel. And it is a story on the day of resurrection. And it is a story that is unique to St. Luke's gospel. And it is a story called The Road to Emmaus. You may have heard about that. I think it's an interesting story. In fact, it is one of the most interesting stories in all of the Gospels, and of course they're filled with interesting stories. It's interesting because it's the longest story in St. Luke's Gospel. It's longer than the crucifixion narrative. It's longer than the birth narrative. It's longer than anything else. 2, it involves characters, aside from our Lord, that we have never encountered in the gospel before. In other words, it's not about Peter or Paul or John or Andrew or any of the others or even Mary Magdalene. It's about 2 people we don't know that we've never seen before. And the story is long. It's very elaborate. St. Luke puts a lot of details into it. And so what I would like to do is try to discover what this story is about, what it means, and then hopefully see what St. Luke intends to tell us theologically. I know it's like, oh, I'm bored already. Listen, you're not half as bored as my Eucharist class this morning. We had to use the defibrillator on one boy this morning. He was so bored, he started drooling out the side of his mouth. He fell over into the aisle. I said, oh, Lord, get that defibrillator out. I didn't know if you use that on someone that doesn't need it, it can kill them. Well, enrollment was going down anyway, so I didn't really, okay. Now I want to look at this story. Now, what I want to do is try to point to something that's very important, and that is why St. Luke has this story in this part of the gospel. Now, how many people did what they were supposed to do and bring their Bible. Let me see that Bible. Where is it? Why does everybody have the same Bible? That's just why you stole those Bibles from the RCIA room. Let me see that thing. Give me that. This thing is written in Greek. You brought your Bibles with you. So if you are looking at your Bibles, turn to chapter 24 of St. Luke's Gospel. And I'm going to read the story, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pieces that are there, and then I hope to kind of give you a little bit about the meaning. So it begins at verse 13. Now remember, it's the day of resurrection. It's that Sunday of resurrection. The women have gone to the tomb. They did not find the body of Jesus there. And so then this is the story. Now that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Okay, so Luke is pretty specific about this village. And talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation which you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. That's very important. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And yes, besides all this, now it is the 3rd day since this happened. And moreover, some women from our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. And they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as these women had said, but him they did not see. Then Jesus said to them, "O foolish people, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further, but they constrained him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. And when they was at table with him, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 gathered together, and those who were with him, who said, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of bread. The story is long. It's a very convoluted story, very detailed story. And a couple of things for us to remember when we're looking at Luke is, one is, for Luke, as a Greek writer, often the real message that he wants to convey is in the details of the story. So he really wants to use these details of the story to convey his message. The other thing, as I indicated very briefly last night, so if you weren't here, this is a recap, okay, is that Luke structures the gospel in a very, very focused way. And so he wants to, at the end of the gospel, bring us to the message that he wants to drive home. Now, if I was talking in my Eucharist class about this, which I did a few weeks ago, and they were like, I would say this. One of the things that St. Luke is very aware of is how to tell a story. And the way he tells the story is in a very Greek way. And the way Greeks told stories, if you're talking about like one of the great Homeric epics, or if you're talking about, for example, one of the dramas, the way the Greeks told stories was they would tell the story, and then right before the end of the story, you have what is called the penultimate speech. Now, this is very fascinating. Watch him. He just fell over, okay? The penultimate speech. And the penultimate speech is at the end of the story, somebody comes on and says, hey, this is what we just happened, and this is what you're supposed to take home with you. And then they go home. And this is exactly what St. Luke is doing in this gospel passage. He's using this longest story in his gospel, this very convoluted story, to deal with the true meaning of where he wants us to go. So here we go, if the message which St. Luke is trying to give us in the gospel is a message about what it means to be Jesus' follower, right? Then this story is going to be where all of Jesus' followers must be going. So this is the story that you're supposed to say, that's where I'm supposed to be. But what does it mean? Now, let me just go through a few points with you, because I think if we look at some of these details, it will be fascinating. It will be. And I will now read it again to you in the original Greek. You don't think I'm going to do that? Lord have mercy. We want to get out of here before midnight, or at least by midnight. So what is happening in this story? Remember that Jesus has about 100 people with whom he's traveling in the Gospel of Luke. And many of these people are folks that we never know their names. We don't know anything about them. But today we encounter two of them. And what happens is these folks who had been following Jesus have now become a little disillusioned, right? So they are decided that, all of this crucifixion, this now business with these crazy women, it's time for us to go. And so this couple of folks are saying, we're going to leave this community. We're going to just take to the road. Now, what's interesting is the question one of the most interesting questions in this gospel is, where were they going? So what does the passage say? Where were they going? Okay, they're going where? Emmaus, right? And where was Emmaus? This is the interesting part. This is the good part. It's 7 miles from Jerusalem. Or if we looked at the Greek text, it's 60 stadia, 60 stadium lengths from Jerusalem. So that's a pretty kind of accurate description of where this town was, right? Now, but what's the problem with this? First of all, where have we heard about the town of Emmaus in the other Gospels? It's not. We haven't. In fact, it's mentioned nowhere in the New Testament, which is an interesting thing considering they talk about all these towns, all these places, and it's supposed to be about 7 miles from Jerusalem, which is not a very long distance. In point of fact, no one knows where the town of Emmaus was. And so, for example, if you go to the back of your Bible, don't do it right now, but if you go to the back of your Bible, you have those very helpful maps. They're not. They're not helpful. But they'll always put the town of Emmaus in there, and all they basically do is draw a circle from Jerusalem, and it could be up here, it could be up here, it could be up here. Couldn't be over here because that would be in the Dead Sea, but it could be almost anywhere on any map because no one knows where it was. It's not mentioned anywhere else. There's no mention of it. And so, in other words, why does St. Luke name the town, tell us where it is, and that these people are going there, when everybody hearing that or reading it in that time would say, hey, I don't know about that town? Why do you think St. Luke does that? And I think the reason that he does it is when we examine the condition of the people going to Emmaus, right? And what are they? Are they happy? Are they joyful? Are they carefree? No, they're sad. They're disappointed. And what are they doing? They're not walking. They are running away from Jerusalem. And I know. Jesus meeting them, Luke's point is, if you are running away from Jerusalem, you're going nowhere. You're going nowhere. And people hearing this in the first century would get that immediately. That is not a town. In other words, they're running away from Jesus. And if you're running away from Jesus, that you're going nowhere. Why? Because there's nowhere else to be but with Jesus. So you have these people, and they're going. Now, who are they? That's another interesting question. We're told the name of one. Now, that's interesting. Does Luke have to name the one? No, he doesn't. He could have just said two people. But we're told the name of one, Cleopas. Now, where else does Cleopas appear in St. Luke's gospel? Follow the logic. He doesn't. Okay, so he doesn't. In fact, we have no Cleopas. We have a character in St. John's gospel whose name is Clopas. You know, is it the same? I don't know. But if you had a Clopas in St. John's gospel, who was Clopas in St. John's gospel? Okay, good. You have very blank faces, exactly like my class in the seminary. Clopas, we are told in John's gospel, that Mary, the wife of Clopas, stood at the foot of Jesus' cross. Is it the same person? I don't know. But if it's the same person, could that other disciple on the road to Emmaus be Mary, the wife? I don't know. Sounds good. It would fit within St. Luke's Greek perspective. One, okay. Husbands and wives are always a team in Greek literature because they stand in for the whole of humanity. Or in Greek literature, if you don't name the character, it's an invitation to insert yourself into the story. So in other words, who is going to Emmaus? Is it a husband and wife, therefore all of humanity? Is it somebody and you? Are we on the road to Emmaus? Now I know all of this is very complicated, but that's, I think, St. Luke's point. So he gets all of these people, whoever they may be, going wherever they're going, but remember what Jesus says. Wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. And so Jesus appears to them. They don't recognize him, but he appears to them. And then he says, what are you talking about? And they say, well, we're talking about Jesus. You know, are you crazy? And they say, oh, yeah, and we thought that he was going to be the Messiah, but we were disappointed. He was not. He was crucified. He died. And this morning, crazy women said something, so we're out of here. And Jesus says, now, really, are you that slow? Did you not know? And he says, this is interesting from Luke's point of view because he says he's going to recount, Jesus recounts every passage from the Old Testament that refers to him. Now, important church teaching. How many passages in the Old Testament refer to Jesus? How many? That's a good number. I don't have any idea what it means, but it's a great number. How many passages in the Old Testament refer to Jesus? In church teaching, every passage in the Old Testament refers to Jesus. So in other words, these people are on a long, long walk. Jesus recounts everything in the Old Testament that refers to him. So they're on one. Then they get to where they're going, and it's dark. So in other words, they left in the morning. How long does it take to walk 7 miles? Maybe 3 hours if you're slow. It doesn't take all day to walk 7 hours, right? So they get to where they're going. It's getting to be dark, and Jesus says he's going to go on. And they say, "Stay with us, for evening is drawing near." Now, 2 important things about stay with us. First of all, they have a stranger on their hands. They are going to invite the stranger to stay with them for the evening. In other words, they learned an important lesson from Jesus, and that was hospitality, right? They think that their experiment with Jesus has been useless, but they have... It came earlier tonight. They think... They think that their experiment with Jesus has been for nothing, right? And yet they have learned... Okay. I'll rush at it before the next one. So they think that their experiment with Jesus has been worthless, but they've learned the important lesson of offering hospitality. They say, "Stay with us, for evening is drawing near." And he goes in to stay with them. The other interesting idea there is that the verb, oh, Lord have mercy. Do you remember diagramming sentences? Wasn't that fun back in the day? I liked it, but they don't do that anymore, So let's diagram. No, let's not. And so he said, "Stay with us." And the word for stay in Greek is lodge. In other words, they've come to what from last night? An inn. They're gone to an inn. So you have the 3 inns in St. Luke's gospel. The inn at the beginning, which rejects Jesus. The inn at the middle, which takes in the man on the road. And the inn at the end, the katalima of Emmaus. And they go in, and what happens? And so we have this very important formula. This is an important formula that everybody should know. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. This is exactly the formula that St. Paul uses. It's exactly the formula that every other gospel writer uses to talk about what? The Eucharist. In other words, Jesus then appears, they recognize him, and he disappears from their sight. And then what do? They get up now in the middle of the night, and they go back to this place from which they were originally fleeing to tell that they have seen. Now, what is that? What is that Emmaus story? So St. Luke says all of discipleship leads us to this story. Everything in your life as a Christian is about this story. What is the story? They gather, they hear word, they break bread, and they go out to tell what they have experienced. What is that? That's Mass, right? So in other words, what is St. Luke showing us? He's showing us that everything in our discipleship leads us right here, right here, right here. This is the most important thing. This is the most important thing. This is what St. Luke is saying. And that, if we can get that, then we have something. One of the things I keep driving home with my students in my Eucharist class is we have become very accustomed in our current thinking of thinking about the Eucharist as something that we do, if we have time. We go to Mass on Sunday if we have time and if we have nothing else to do. That's not St. Luke's image of what discipleship is about. Discipleship is about placing the Mass at the center of your life and having every other aspect of your life circle around that center. It's not seeing the Mass as something that is in your life, but seeing it as the center of your life. Now, let me talk about somebody I never talk about. Thomas Merton. Have you ever heard of him? We live just down the road here. Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton wrote a book called The Seven-Story Mountain. It was a autobiography. It's his story about his conversion. And he says this in the book, and I always go back to it. He says in the book that he, Thomas Merton, was at Gethsemane, where he was a monk. He was serving Mass one morning in one of the side chapels. And he said during the elevation of the host at Mass, he realized that host, that sacrament, he said, was the only thing that keeps the world from flying apart. Oh my. In other words, what we encounter here, what is reposed in this tabernacle, is the only thing that keeps the world from flying apart. If it did not exist, then we would not exist. The world would not exist. You know what? That's true. But we don't always know it, do we? We don't always understand it, do we? And lots of things can take the place of worshiping on Sunday, and lots of things can take the place of this. And we can lose sight of this. We can take communion without thinking about what it is, right? But here we have the soul, body, and divinity of Christ. Him, not a symbol of him, but him. Do we know that? Do we know that's what we're encountering? Do we know that that's what we're going to encounter tonight? If we know that, then we know the whole thing. If we don't know that, then I would say, along with Thomas Merton, and this is the only thing I'd probably say along with Thomas Merton, Benedictines, they don't like Cistercians and Trappists, so that's all right. If we know that, we know the whole thing. If we don't know that, we don't know anything. If we don't know that, we're impoverished. If we don't know that, we're not really probably living up to our full humanity. Those are hard things to hear, and yet they're true. What happens here makes an amazing difference in the world. That's what St. Luke is leading us to. Okay, now, I have two stories tonight, okay? Is that all right? Can I tell two stories? I'm going to tell two stories. I'm going to drop this here. Remember my parents. Remember we were in the car going on vacation, right, last night? If you weren't here last night, we have Thomas, my dad. We have Margaret, my mother. Thomas and Margaret. They're wonderful people. My father has been gone for a while now, but my mother is still a live wire. So I talked to her on the phone this morning. I said, Mom, I'm giving a mission over in Elizabethtown. She said, wasn't there a movie about that? I said, no. And she said, I hope you're not telling any stories about me and your daddy. And I said, no. But remember last night, if you were here, and if you weren't, I'm telling you, last night we were on the way to visit who? Grandma. So we were off to visit Grandma, and we would arrive at Grandma's, and Grandma was Grandma, and grandmas are always the same, and my grandma was no exception. So she'd see the car pull up, and she'd be running out to the car, with her bosoms bouncing, with the flour all over her because she's been baking, At least that's how I like to remember it. And of course, we had Stinky, that we've carried the whole way, so he'd slink off, and we wouldn't hear anything else about him. And we would get out, and then we would be at Grandma's for like 2 days, right? And my grandma would say, now, honey, I'm going to tell you something, and you may not like it. And I'm like, uh-oh. She said, your mama and daddy have decided that they're going out on their own for a little while. And they're going to leave you here with me. And so I'm thinking, dumped at Grandma's, Now, she thinks that that's supposed to be a little bit of a problem for me, that I'm going to be sad. But internally, I'm going, yes. Freed from this constantly, living with Grandma. Grandma is extremely permissive, as grandmas tend to be, right? And so what will life be like for me? So in the next few weeks, this is what life is going to be like for me. There will be drinking of sweet beverages, which I was never allowed to have at home because my mother said it made me hyper. When she was one to talk, So you could have all the sweet beverages you want. And my favorite was sweet tea, which is a Southern specialty, right? Right. So I'm having the sweet tea all the time. I could eat pickles out of the jar, which I was never allowed to do at home because my mother said that dill pickles made your blood dry up, which I have done serious investigation. Medically, it is not the case. So you could eat the pickles and do what? Drink the juice right out of the jar. That is heaven to me. Do you know what I do every night before I go to bed? Every night before I eat. Explains a lot, doesn't it? You could do nothing. You could catch lightning bugs. Anybody seen a lightning bug? I don't know, do they still have lightning bugs? Maybe they died out. I don't know if they even have them. But they catch lightning bugs. You get a jar. You forget, of course, to punch the holes in the lid so they die, You unscrew the jar. You reach your hand in. You pull out a lightning bug, right? And then what do? You squish it and you apply it to your face. So you rub that bug's butt all over your face until what? You glow in the dark, of course, which is what you're supposed to do at Grandma's, or you just sit in the swing. You sit in the swing on the front porch. It's hot as heck. It's summer, and it's like creak, 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 creak. And inside, Grandma's watching the television, and she's got it blaring so loud because she doesn't hear so well. And so the television is blaring, and it's the Carol Burnett show or something, and you're out on the porch because that's where you want to be. And then also during the summer, my grandma would be the recipient of visits also from my cousins, right? And that was great because I was an only child. So it was great to have these cousins, but I was also the youngest. And that necessitates a little bit of what we might call friendly meanness. In other words, they would tell me things knowing that they weren't true, but I was so gullible that I would believe them. Like, why don't you go down to the river bank and hunt for Confederate gold? Because it's all down there buried in the river. Well, yes, it is, I guess. I don't know. I still don't know until today. But I would spend the entire day digging in this red clay dirt until I looked like a huge pile of mud or a brick. And I would go home, and if I had encountered my mother in such a condition, there would be, pardon me, Lord, heck to pay. But Grandma just said, aren't you the cutest thing? Look at you. Grandmas are like that, And you begin to wonder, were they ever parents? But then, anyway, so you get, and my cousins were terrible, and they would tell me these awful stories, right? And so their favorite story to tell was a story, and I'm going to have to make up a name, because I used to tell the real name in this story until this couple in the church where I told the story came up to me afterwards and said, "That's our name." I said, "I'm going to change the name." So we're going to call them the Smiths. Now, I know there's somebody here named Smith, and I don't really care. Because if you have such a common name, you have to be, figure out that you're going to be told stories about. So the Smiths. And the Smiths were the endless story that my cousins would talk about. They were twins, the Smiths. And they were also what we called, now I'm not saying this is the thing to do it, don't do it. We call them the white trash children. They were the Smiths. I won't tell you their real name. See me after. And so we talked about them. And their names were Peggy and Kenny. And they were real small. And they went around naked all the time. See, in the South, you don't go naked, you go naked. So they were naked all the time. And they had big bulbous heads. And you couldn't tell the boy from the girl. Now remember, I was very young, okay? Very young. I think today I could tell. But so they're telling me all this stuff. And so that was the endless conversation on the porch, creak, creak, creak at night. Well, one night, Grandma had turned the TV off early, and she heard us talking outside. And so she came outside and she said, "What are you talking about out here?" You know you're in trouble when Grandma puts her hands on her hips, right? Or she gets that purse out. That's bad. So she said, this is what we're going to do. You should never talk about children like that. That's just awful. We're going tomorrow to visit those dear children. And I'm like, yes. That is pay dirt. You get to see the object of your fascination. So we're going out to visit the white trash children. And I was very excited. So I got up early. I put on my best suit. It was seersucker suit. It was a very handsome suit. I wish I still had it. Seersucker suit with a bow tie. I put the whole hair oil in. Boing! I was ready to go. I gobbled down my breakfast, and she said, "Let's get in the car, we're going to go." So we got into the car, right? And we got into the car, and we started driving. And she had a little box that she put in the back seat. And we got in the car, we started driving. So we went past Main Street. That's where my grandpa had his drugstore and funeral parlor. Because my grandpa, who had been dead for like 200 years at that point, was the druggist and the undertaker in the town. You try to work that one out, okay? Contradiction. Anyway, we drove past the Baptist church. We drove past the Methodist church. We drove past the Pentecostal church. Now, that is the edge of civilization. We drove out into the country. We drove into the cotton fields. And you have this huge, huge clouds of red dirt that are just surrounding the car because you have no paved roads anymore. And we drove and we drove and we drove, and we got finally to where we were. The car slows down. We pull into, it wasn't a driveway, it was kind of just a gutter. And there's a mailbox that looked like it had been shot, and it said Smith. I made it up. Didn't say that. Their name was Yao. Okay, I just have to say it. Yao, which was a great name, really, wasn't it? Yao. And so we pulled in and we stopped, and we get out, and the dust kind of settles. And my grandmother, she's dressed to the nines. She's got that blue hair all perfectly coiffed, right? And she's all dressed up with her black outfit and her hat and her gloves and everything. It's the summer. She says to me, I get out of the car, she says to me, "You stay here and you be good." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So she gets that little box and she goes up on the porch of this house. Now this house, let me tell you, I don't even know if it was a house. It was up on cinder blocks, and you could look up under it, right? And you could see to the other side. And it weren't far. And, it had all the stereotypical stuff. It had the washing machine and the sofa. It was a red leather sofa. And the screen doors were hanging off, and there was plastic on the windows, and she went in. Anyway, she goes inside, and I'm standing there in this alien landscape in a seersucker suit with a big bow tie, and the hair's just sticking out. I also had my Buster Brown shoes on. I'm still wearing Buster Brown shoes. So we're standing there, right? I'm standing there, and around the corner come them, the white trash children, Peggy and Kenny. And I saw them, and my face just fell. I had been lied to again. They did not have big bulbous heads. They had on perfectly clean overalls. You could easily tell the boy from the girl, even in my naive state. And they came around the side of the house, and they stand in front of me. And so we're standing there just looking at each other. And finally, I'm about 5 years old at this point, I'm 25. No, I'm just kidding. I'm like 5 years old. And finally, the little girl says to her brother, "Give it to him." And I'm like, whoa, I'd heard that before. That's when you duck, right? But the blow never came. And then she said, "We got you something." And I said, "Oh." And then she said to her brother, "Give it to him now." But instead of hitting me, he reached into the bib of his overalls, and he pulls out, like a hockey puck, it was a biscuit. And it was blue. Blue as could be. It was a blue biscuit. And he reaches out and he holds it out to me, and she says, "Take it!" I said, "Our daddy said you was a gentleman." And I said, "I am a gentleman, and I am pleased to meet you." She said, "Take it!" The boy never said a word. And she said, "We saved it for you from our breakfast. We didn't eat it. We didn't even gnaw on it. We saved it for you." I was just waiting for a moment, waiting. "Well, take it!" So I reached out my hand, and I placed it over the biscuit. And for just a second, our skin touched. They call that the kick galvanic, that shock you get from touching people sometime. And I got that shock. And I took the biscuit and I put it in my hand. And then she said, "Well, eat it." And I said, and just as I was putting my mouth on the biscuit, like a little hurricane, my grandmother came out of the house, twirled around in the yard, grabbed my arm, said, "Say goodbye to these nice children, we have to go," threw me in the back seat of the car, shut the door, got in the front, started the car, and backed out in a cloud of red dust. And we were gone. So we're sitting in the car, and I'm in the back seat with my biscuit, and she says, "Give me that dirty thing." And I said, "What thing?" "The dirty thing, the thing they gave you." I said, "You mean my biscuit? Give it to me." And so she took it. You know how parents and grandparents have this ability to do this. She grabbed the biscuit, she rolled down the window in the car, and she threw it out. So I turned around, and I could see in the cloud of red dust, the biscuit bounced once, twice, 3 times, went into the ditch. But let me tell you this. My whole life, I've been haunted by that biscuit. It was a gift given in poverty. Do you know what I'm saying? It was a gift given by a poor child. It was a gift given by which that child had to make a sacrifice. And I think about it all the time. I think about it when you see that red sun, in the evening sometimes, or that bright moon coming up over the field of cut corn. Or the host rising above the altar, right? And then you realize, of course, that the sun and the moon and the host and the biscuit are one thing. An act of God's mercy.